It is still kind of a walking on eggshells situation I think we find ourselves in. And I'm really grateful for the chance to connect with some String of Pearls folks in the middle of Passover. This is kind of a text study / conversation exploring a couple of people's ideas, contemporary thinkers' ideas about one way we might think about Moses's leadership style. You do not need to be an expert in the entire story arc of Moses in the Torah in order to participate and have fun. And I am sharing over other people's ideas, and I haven't made up my mind about them myself. So I'm super curious to hear your thoughts. And if we stay this size, please feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up. If we get a few more people, then maybe we'll start using the hand raise function and whatnot on Zoom. I did set this to be recording. If I hope nobody has an objection to that. I don't really have any grand plans, but it just seems like it might be, if there's some material here that's useful, it might be good for some other adult ed purpose. So I thought, why not? Okay, I'm going to share my screen, folks. Here we go. So this is an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about Moses and different types of leadership. And I want to start, oh look, Anna's here. I want to start by actually jumping into Moses's story after the liberation from Egypt, soon after the liberation from Egypt. And these are a couple of verses from Exodus chapter 5. And I want to ask Debbie if you'd be willing to just read these verses. And where it has Yud Hey Vav Hey, you can just say Hashem or Adonai or God, whatever suits you.
Sure. As they left Pharaoh's presence, they came upon Moses and Aaron standing in their path. And they said to them, "May Adonai look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his courtiers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us."
And just to end the suspense, the they in the first verse are the various Hebrew slaves, overseers, and leaders. They're Hebrew slaves themselves. And this is shortly after Moses first confronts Pharaoh at God's order and says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "I'm not going to do that. I'll tell you what I will do, though. I will make them all make the bricks they're required to make without any straw. They'll have to go fetch their own straw instead of having it provided to them." So things get worse, and this is the response that Moses gets. Now, a little bit later, shortly after they have escaped Egypt, after the euphoria of the miraculous redemption and the splitting of the sea and the newfound freedom, after all of that settles a little bit within a matter of days, they are kind of struggling with the fact that they don't have any food or water. And so, Debbie, will you hit it again?
"If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death."
Okay, so this is the first of many complaints. The Hebrews repeatedly in the part of Exodus that follows the liberation complain. And then Leviticus follows Exodus. Leviticus doesn't really have much narrative in it. It's like a big interruption of the story so that we can learn about all the rules and rituals for the ancient priests. But when the narrative picks up again in the book of Numbers after Leviticus, Numbers really is the odyssey of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And there's a whole lot more complaining that Moses has to face from the Israelites during the book of Numbers as well. So let's consider a couple examples of that. Oh, but before we do, some contemporary art in honor of the spirit of these texts.
There's a great New Yorker cartoon, by the way, that really captures this phase.
Oh, yeah?
I'll see if I can dig it up.
Okay. If you
Really
find it, I'll make you co-host so you can share it. But Hillary, would you be willing to read this particular verse?
Yeah, sure. If
This is
only
from
we
the
had
book of
meat.
Numbers.
If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna.
Yeah, we never see anything but this miraculous, entirely nutritious food stuff that rains down graciously from the sky through no merit of our own.
But it is boring as all get out.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
40 years of manna is not, exactly a Seder dinner.
I hear you. I mean, anything can get old, even supernaturally, wonderfully manifested magic food can get old. Actually, Anne, will you hit the next one?
And at least it's
Yeah.
not the bread of affliction.
I
Good
will
point.
tell you what my granddaughter said when she first tasted matzah after we talked about it at the first family Seder. She took one bite and looked up at me. She was 4. And she said, "It's wood.
There you go.
Why have you brought this trouble on your servant?"
Oh,
What
sorry.
have I
Let me
done?
interrupt you. Let me interrupt you. I'm so sorry. This is after like the umpteenth complaint. So this is Moses talking to God.
Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I've found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin.
So this may be the oldest example of a text that basically says, just shoot me now. It is really quite striking. All right, so far, a few snapshots from different moments in Moses's life as liberator, as redeemer. So now we get to have a chance to sort of hear what a couple of contemporary rabbis have done with these passages as they have considered the work of several different people who've kind of become widely recognized group systems theory and leadership experts, particularly Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who I believe are at the Harvard School of Government. And some years ago, I want to say 25 or plus years ago, they coined these two terms, technical leadership and adaptive leadership. If this happens to be familiar to anybody who's with us right now, I invite you to unmute and offer your quick definition of if this is familiar. Okay, often there are people in the room who are familiar with this stuff, but not always. So the basic idea is that technical leadership is when they say that, what they mean is it's the leadership that is needed to solve problems for which the methods already exist and are known, and have been successfully solved before using these different methods. So, you know, I have a sore throat and a fever. I go to the doctor diagnoses me and finds out, you know, using the right kinds of tests that I have bronchitis and gives me the right kinds of antibiotics, and I'm better. So that's technical leadership. Adaptive leadership is the kind of leadership that's needed for a situation for which nobody really has ever solved this kind of problem before. It's going to require serious adaptation, not just on the part of leaders, but on the part of the whole group in all likelihood. So, you know, great example that these guys have been writing about and invited to speak about over and over again in the last 2 years is COVID as an adaptive leadership challenge. Getting people to adapt to new ways of doing things, to accept that previous ways of dealing with vaguely similar previous problems will not work, will not solve the problem this time. And adaptive leadership is really hard. Adaptive leadership is disorienting, is scary. It requires a certain amount of faith in leaders who are claiming that they have figured out what some good adaptive measures are. It also requires a willingness to experiment through some trial and error in order to collectively figure out the solution. Adaptive leadership for whole societies usually results in leaders trying to chart the way, facing huge reactionary pushback. A lot of the leaders who are most notable as brilliant, amazing, courageous, adaptive leaders end up assassinated, and then are revered posthumously after their societies later kind of finally get the message that real adaptation was needed. So that's like the Cliff's Notes on that. Another person who teaches and writes about this is Sharon Parks. And I wanted to ask, I was going to actually ask Rob if you'd be willing to read this part where she tries to offer her definition.
Sure. Technical problems, even though they may be complex, can be solved with knowledge and procedures already in hand. In contrast, adaptive challenges require new learning, innovation, and new patterns of behavior. In this view, leadership is the activity of mobilizing people to address adaptive challenges, those challenges that cannot be resolved by expert knowledge and routine management alone. Adaptive challenges often appear as swamp issues, tangled, complex problems composed of multiple systems that resist technical analysis and thus stand in contrast to the high, hard ground issues that are easier to address, but where less is at stake for the organization or the society. They ask for more than changes in routine or mere performance. They call for changes of heart and mind, the transformation of longstanding habits and deeply held assumptions and values.
Thank you. Okay, so I stopped sharing for a moment because I want to give us a chance to digest what we've covered so far. So what we've covered so far is I threw a few examples of texts of Moses facing the kvetching and complaining of of the Israelites. And I included the passage in which Moses is at his wit's end and is really ready to give up. And then we pivoted and we got a super quick tutorial on, late 20th century, early 21st century school of governance and corporate management stuff on, types of leadership. I'll tell you where we're going. Where we're going is we'll get to hear from two different contemporary rabbis who think they have spotted where Moses is functioning as a technical leader and where he's functioning as an adaptive leader and where he messes up. And they have a very different way of breaking it down. And I think it'll be fun to look at that. But before we do that, I kind of want to stop and invite us to have a little shared conversation. These are sort of meaty, juicy issues that are very relevant to the challenges we face right now in our own society. And so I'm just kind of wanting to open it up and invite folks to share how some of this speaks to you or what it raises for you. If you would like to chime in, and I see Anne raising her hand.
Just thinking that, here we are 2 years into the pandemic and various requests and controls, and we've already seen how a lot of it is breaking down. People don't want to pay attention. It's done. They're done with it. They're sick of it. They don't want to hear about it anymore. They want to believe that COVID's gone away. Nobody should have to wear masks. All the stuff going on. And it's only 2 years. Poor Moses, he's got to deal with this for 40 years. So people are people. They don't deal well as a group with lots of restrictions, as we see every day.
I'm not getting this difference. So I haven't shut my shades yet. So I live across the street from a church, and right now the Alcoholics Anonymous is gathering. Right now, they have certain. I'm aware vaguely of them. I've only been into their meeting to ask someone to remove a car from my driveway. But is this adaptive or technical? I mean, they have a 12-step program, but every individual responds to it differently.
It must have been adaptive at one point before somebody thought up a different, right, but a different way. Well, it adapts to every person, but the leadership of it, the idea of doing that 12-step program was adaptive at some point, but probably it's as they set up each new one, it's become technical because now they know how to do that. On an individual level, it's always adaptive.
I don't know if they still know how to do it. I think they have to still confront each individual and confront that individual.
No, I meant like set up a group, set up a 12-step program in a church basement and invite people to come. That's already been done. And if they want to run an AA, now it's technical. Whereas,
but if you're running it and somebody doesn't respond to your idea of a higher power, you have to adapt to their idea of a higher power.
Well, from what I know of them, I think
they do. Actually, but I don't know if they really do adapt that much. I think they pretty much stick to the program as they see it.
There also must be, acts of adaptation inside of technical leadership, right? It doesn't mean that these things are, completely separate worlds, because they involve humanity or human nature.
Right. Well, and that's my objection to the dichotomy.
Are you talking about, Rabbi, the leader or everybody? Because what I thought the people who you highlighted now, they're talking about individuals who are in charge of other individuals, like Moses was in charge of all those cranky followers, right? And that's the focus of adaptive or technical as opposed to each individual.
I think that the contemporary writers that we've looked at are trying to give advice to leaders. So they're talking about, but I think that according to their theory, that one of the most important things to identify is whether you are a leader in a community or an organization that is currently facing primarily technical challenges or adaptive challenges, with all of the caveats granted that this is a bit of a forced binary. But I think that even though life is in reality tends to be more messy and blended, that this kind of theoretical forced binary can be very useful, especially if it helps a leader figure out that one of the reasons why things aren't going well is that they really are facing a uniquely adaptive situation. And so I think they would also say the leader doesn't have the magic powers to get the whole group to adapt, but the leader's minimal responsibility is to communicate and inform and explain that from how they see it, that's what everyone's facing, and to give it a shot to try to motivate people to muster the courage and creativity that an adaptive situation is going to call for. So I see Rob and then Judy.
Well, what I've had very, very basic training in through work is the idea of transformational versus transactional leadership, which I suppose is, to me, seems a little bit similar, but transactional is you're doing the same things that you've always done. It's getting tasks done and leading your team and getting tasks done, versus transformational, where you are encouraging change and welcoming change and looking at things in a more strategic way than you do when you are transactional in your style. So I've heard that versus the idea of adaptive, and that concept. And I'm not sure if those are the right terms to use or not in this case, because I'm not sure exactly how it's meant, but
They cut differently. Then my AA meeting is transformational.
I want to hold off on that because I know Judy wanted to jump in, but we can certainly come back to 12-step.
So the way I'm reacting is influenced by some nuts and bolts experiences I've had in the past and I'm going through right now with groups in which I'm a leader, which is, I guess nowadays it's sometimes called crowdsourcing, and I sometimes call it brainstorming. And the idea is to use the novice mind. Hopefully there'll actually be people there who are novices to the system and can ask questions like, why do we do it this way? Why don't we do it that way? And where the answer could be, this is the way we've always done it. And then one can question that. Okay, and the other idea, the idea of brainstorming is people imagine lots of different ways of dealing with it, some of which are totally impractical, but some of which stimulate more practical ideas in somebody else. And so that it becomes not just the leader coming up with ideas, but eliciting ideas from others and thereby encouraging group buy-in, because everybody's been encouraged to imagine solutions and react to other people's imaginations of solutions.
Thank you. Others want to chime in here?
It does make a lot of sense to me, I have to say. I mean, it reminds me of what I feel we deal with all the time at my job, where, there's stuff like changing how people enter their time in their timesheets, right? And you need to sort of impose let's say, a new systematic way of doing things or something like that. As opposed to figuring out how to solve the problem with our god awful client, which is so complicated and has so many layers and has to do with our behavior and their behavior, and new issues and old issues. And it reminds me of how that woman sort of describes this melange of things that are complicated.
Would it be useful to put her passage back up on the screen? That's a shrug. I'm gonna, without something more enthusiastic than a shrug, I'm not gonna do it.
Well, I don't know if others would find it useful, but
Sorry, I couldn't see. Did anyone else gesture?
It
It's
seems
fine,
to
you
me
can
that
put it back up.
it seems to me that all these different things that people are talking about are shades of the same way of looking at things. It's transactional, or it's whatever it is, or it's adaptive, whatever. And Paul, you're right, the different ones cut slightly differently, but they're all trying to look at ways of either we do it this way or we open it up to wider thinking or new ideas.
So I have a couple thoughts I'd love to share. One is, as somebody who for years has gone to a lot of Al-Anon meetings, which are like the 12-step meetings for people who have loved ones who struggle with addiction. I feel like I've gotten to know that culture pretty well. And my own take on the question of what kind of problems, adaptive or technical, are being addressed there, I think it's a kind of both. I think that 12-step is based on the idea that the 12-step community long ago discovered a technical solution to addiction that is not easy, and from, according to their belief, cannot be done alone, requires repeated participation in the group. But I think that if they were forced to reckon with this terminology, that a lot of them would say that for the individual member, particularly for someone trying to overcome the worst aspects of an addiction and become sober, that for that person, what the group helps them achieve is nothing short of an adaptive change. That the way they understand the grip of addiction is that it requires a radical transformation in thought and habit and practice and social interaction. And the group is there to try to provide support and encouragement and reinforcement for people attempting to make this very adaptive and difficult transformative change. But they are rather rigid as a group about following their rubric, and they're not going to deviate from that. So I think it's a really fascinating example, actually, for this. And then the other thought I wanted to just share before we look at some more slides is one of the things that I think politicians seeking the high, seeking very high office. Anything major, governor, senator, or or bigger. How often do we hear some version of, the old technical problem-solving strategies? I mean, they're not using that language, they're using folksier language. They're basically saying, none of that works. I'm gonna change it all. I have a different approach. I'm sick of those idiots, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different result. They're a bunch of knuckleheads. And, I'm going to be the adaptive leader. Or I'm going to bring adaptive leadership to Washington. I'm on your side. You and I know that we need adaptive change. Those knuckleheads can't seem to figure that out. I mean, I just feel like that's been repeated forever by, and I'm not even trying to get into the terrifying times, flirtation with fascism and the end of democracy that we've been in, continue to experience tremendous anxiety around. I'm talking way bigger than that. So I don't know. I think that's one of the ways in which this language kind of comes into play.
I think, though, transformational leadership does not necessarily mean transforming to something better.
Right.
And
I agree.
I think that actually it's been historically leaders who are autocratic, evil, that have done the worst things, that in some ways are transformational, because they somehow they lead by getting someone to follow to buy into their vision, to be able in a feeling like they're being consulted to do things, as opposed to transactional. That you're going to do this and you're going to get this in return. And it's the same way the same methods that we've been using to solve problems before. But transformational is more looking at it in a way of how do I lead in a way that that gets my followers or the people who are working for me or under my leadership in whatever capacity, how do I get them to engage, to think about things, to encourage them to get new ideas and to work on those ideas and not squash them, for example.
Well, can I say something? I'm not sure whether these leaders transformed the way people thought and acted, but if you think about it in terms of politics, Abraham Lincoln was a transformational leader. FDR was a transformational leader. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a transformational leader. Probably Ronald Reagan was a transformational leader. Now, I don't know whether they transformed the way people felt. They certainly transformed the way the world operated.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'll give you an example of a moment when I really was thunderstruck by the audacity of a initially successful and ultimately, I think, failed transformational leader. So I had the good fortune to visit the Leo Beck Rabbinical Seminary in London a few years ago. And the librarian there was giving me a tour, and she said, we have some really wonderful artifacts in this one room. Would you like to see them? So long story short, she produces this large medallion, this coin that is authentic. And it was a medallion that Napoleon had struck and given to all of the Jewish leaders of France that he convened for his great Sanhedrin. I don't know if those of you know about this, but this was basically part of Napoleon's vision of his sort of forced enlightenment on all that he would conquer. And his message to the Jews of France was, you get nothing as a collective, but you get everything as individual French citizens. And I want you to have a body of community leaders that I can entreat with directly. And I'm calling it the Great Sanhedrin because I like naming things I create after momentous historical things from the past. And I'm having medals struck, and each of you gets to keep a medal from attending this. And the medal showed a sort of man who's supposed to be a Jew because he had a beard and a talit. And it showed Napoleon with like rays shining out of his head, handing the Jew the Torah. Now, that's audacious, transformational, disruptive, new world order building leadership. And not
But
necessarily
is that
leadership
or just self-aggrandizement?
I mean, I think we're sort of dancing around the boundary of where we recognize that adaptive leadership can be toxic, right? And let's try to pull it back. I think that these governance and systems theory folks like Sharon Parks and Ron Heifetz are thinking about things in a more benign framework. I think they're thinking more about clubs and churches and companies and civic organizations, and they're kind of speaking to scenarios that aren't necessarily involving charismatic would-be fascist tyrants breaking the system in order to impose their own vision on everyone. They're really trying to focus more on how can we discern when we really do need leadership that's trying to help the group find the creativity and courage and patience to go through a necessary adaptation, as opposed to continue to reapply techniques and tools that have been useful in the past, but maybe just aren't going to succeed this time. So I'm going to push on. And I want to talk about
Chief Rabbi.
The former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, wonderful, deeply humanistic Orthodox rabbi, and also a champion of Jewish pluralism, kind of a rare figure, and sadly no longer of this world. But one of the things that he wrote about, he liked this Heifetz technical and adaptive challenge framework. The way Sacks put it in one of his talks was, he says, technical challenge is one where you have a problem and you or someone else who's already known has the solution. So he gives the example of you're sick, you go to the doctor, you get a pill, follow the instructions. Adaptive challenges are different. And he has a slightly different way of putting it than what I've shared before. He says adaptive challenges arise when we are part of the problem. So if I'm ill and I go to the doctor and she tells me I can give you a pill, but the truth is you're going to have to change your lifestyle. You're going to have to start exercising and doing these other, stretches. The tools I have won't help you. Won't help until you've changed the way you live. So then Sachs says adaptive leadership is called for when the whole world is changing, when circumstances are no longer what they were, and what once worked cannot work anymore. There's no simple following of instructions. We collectively have to change. So he then goes on to say that he feels like, broadly speaking, in the book of Exodus, Moses is repeatedly called upon, either by the people's complaints or by God, to exercise technical leadership. And here's what he means by that. He says, the Israelites are enslaved. God sends signs and wonders, 10 plagues, and then the Israelites go free. The Israelites need to escape from Pharaoh's pursuing chariots. God says to Moses, lift up your staff, and God divides the sea. They're hungry, God sends manna. They're thirsty, God sends water from the rock. There's a problem. The people complain to Moses. Moses takes the issue to God. God provides the solution. And this is kind of his way of describing Exodus. And bear in mind, in terms of timeline, Exodus covers the whole drama between Moses and Pharaoh and let my people go and 10 plagues and splitting of the sea, and then goes on for about another 7 weeks. They're about 7 weeks out of Egypt when they arrive at Mount Sinai, and then they get the revelation there, the 10 commandments. And Exodus extends maybe a few weeks beyond that, and then it stops. Right? So in contrast, the book of Numbers picks up somewhere after those first liminal weeks of freedom, and it takes us all the way through to year 40 of their wandering in the wilderness. So Numbers really covers that whole 40-year stretch. And a lot of the narratives in the book of Numbers are kind of the stories of the adventures and misadventures, successes and failures of the Israelites on their wandering journey, right? So here's what Sachs writes. Sachs writes, in the book of Numbers, the equation has changed. The Israelites have completed the first part of their journey. They left Egypt. They reached Mount Sinai. They made a covenant with God. Now they're on their way to the promised land. Moses's role is now different. Instead of providing technical leadership, he has to provide adaptive leadership. He has to get the people to change, the people to exercise responsibility in new ways, the people to learn to do things for themselves while trusting in God instead of relying on God to do stuff for them. And it doesn't work. He keeps trying to get the people to make those changes, but either he doesn't have what it takes to get them to do it, or he's not to blame. It just wasn't possible for them. And what Sachs says is, by the time we get to the passage where Moses, in so many words, says to God, just shoot me, Sachs says Moses has come to sense rightly that the people are simply unable to change their pattern of response, and that this is the result of years of slavery. They are passive, dependent. They've lost the capacity for self-motivated action. We will discover, says Rabbi Sachs, that it's going to take a new generation, born in freedom, in the wilderness, to develop the strengths needed for self-governance, which is a precondition of freedom. So then he goes on to offer a few thoughts about adaptive leadership, and he tries to tie it to the contemporary moment that he was writing in at the time, which was a few years ago. And I'll just add that he says adaptive leadership is intensely difficult. He says people resist change. They erect barriers against it. Denial, anger, blame. That is why adaptive leadership is emotionally draining in the extreme. And he even goes on to say many of the great adaptive leaders, Lincoln, Gandhi, MLK, were assassinated. Their greatness was posthumous. Only in retrospect were they seen by their own people as heroes. At the time, many of them were seen by a huge part of the population they were leading as a dangerous threat to the status quo. He goes on to say more about sort of, Judaism and the antidote to despair. But let's move on. I want to talk for a minute about a much younger and very much still alive contemporary rabbi, a millennial rabbi named Danya Ruttenberg. She's a very prolific writer, and she also is interested in the same theory of adaptive versus technical leadership. But she has a different take on where we should see what parts of the Torah are speaking most clearly about these questions of these two different types of leadership. So for her, it's not that there's this big divide between Exodus and Numbers that maps neatly, onto Moses's career and the people he's leading's career with different kinds of challenges and what kind of adaptation is necessary. She's really interested in the episode of the golden calf, and that episode happens in the book of Exodus. But before we get to the golden calf disaster, she wants to remind us of what this group of people has just gone through. So here's what she writes. She says, let's talk about trauma, terror, and the golden calf for a moment, shall we? Let's start by going back a few steps. The Israelites were in Egypt for 400 some odd years, enslaved, and we know that the infant Moses was actually part of Pharaoh's genocidal design, which he started only after his oppression with hard labor didn't succeed in stopping the Israelites flourishing to the degree to which he would have liked. Right? What she means by that is Moses was supposed to be drowned in the Nile. So he was part of Pharaoh's genocidal design. But of course, fate, or in our case, God, plays a role, and Moses ends up having a very different childhood. The Israelites, who only ever knew enslavement, are present for the terror of the 10 plagues and of the breathlessness of the preparation to flee, and of the Sea of Reeds parting. It is a lot. She's going to contrast that with Moses's upbringing, which was in the Pharaoh's court. So she's not saying Moses didn't have traumas of his own to deal with, but she is going to say that they are really different than the kinds of traumas all the rest of the Israelites, the Hebrew slaves, had to deal with. So she's basically setting the stage here, and she says, okay, the Exodus happens, the people flee, the sea splits, they come out the other side. Then, after 7 weeks of liminality in the desert, they get to Mount Sinai, and Exodus tells us the following. Someone who hasn't read would be willing to read.
Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for God had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey, but let not God speak to us lest we die.
So she then says, whoa, this is a heavy experience that this group of people has now just been subjected to. And you can keep reading or tag someone else.
When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that man Moses who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." And all the people took off the gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. This he took from them and cast in a mold and made it into a molten calf. And they exclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron announced, "Tomorrow shall be a festival of God." Early next day, the people offered up burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being and sat down to eat and drink, and then rose to dance.
Okay, thank you. So Rabbi Ruttenberg says that this divine revelation, I'm quoting her, is so much. And at first, the Israelites are okay with Moses going and getting the Torah and telling them what's in it. They rather him report back to them than hear directly from God. It's just too much. They need a break from all this raw theophany, she writes. And then she reminds us that this is all playing out really differently for Moses than for all the other Israelites, including his brother Aaron. Right? She says, Moses was raised in the Pharaoh's palace, remember? By the time he was an adult, he knew he was an Israelite, but he did not grow up with the same experiences of oppression and trauma. She says, I'm not making any definitive statements about trying to compare one person's trauma to another. I can't and I shouldn't. But she says, I'm just noting that in this case, Moses' lived experiences were so different from literally everyone else out there in the desert. So Moses, the guy who told them that getting out of Egypt was possible, who got them out of Egypt, who arranged with God for all the stuff to happen in the desert for the last 7 weeks, that guy, he goes all the way up Mount Sinai and leaves everyone down there at the base waiting. I'm quoting from her directly here. And so now the Israelites have been taken out of Egypt, had a profound but terrifying experience. And then their leader bounces and they're supposed to just chill. And it's 1 week, another week, still no Moses, waiting. And she says, adaptive leader, now she brings in the adaptive leadership stuff. And she unpacks what they're saying it's all about. She says that Heifetz and Linsky and these other folks, they talk about the difference between technical and adaptive challenges. Technical fixes are ones where the solution can be known. You maybe need to call in the right expert, but there's clarity about what to do. Adaptive challenges, on the other hand, are ones that put us into entirely new terrain. Nobody has ever solved this problem before. Not in this way, not with these factors. Or maybe we're in terrain that's only new for us, but still there's an existential change in there that we need to make. Something that's not just a new way of doing something, something that we need to become, something that will alter our identity. That's what needs to happen. Since the solution is unknown, adaptive challenges involve experimentation, failure, disorientation, conflict, all of which must be uncomfortably endured for a long time. It's not comfortable. It is really, really, really hard to stay in that place. It takes the right leader to help usher people through this process, right? So she's wanting us to sympathize with the Hebrews at the base of the mountain, waiting and waiting and waiting for Moses, who doesn't seem to be coming back. And the pressure is building. And she writes, so now the guy that the Israelites had been looking to for protection and direction and order is gone. And the Israelites are no longer in the horrific, oppressive, but at least familiar space of Egypt. They're in the desert, alone, with no way to make sense of everything that's happening. And who has been left in charge? Aaron, who did not grow up in a palace. He is every bit as traumatized as the people he's supposed to be leading in his role as Vice Moses. He is dealing with and processing the same stuff they are, right? And so what happens? We just read it, Exodus chapter 32. Aaron says, go gather the gold, and he casts this molten calf, and they make a festival. And here's what Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg says about that. She says, what's happened here is the people say to Aaron, let's make a deity who can lead us, who can provide protection, direction, and order, because who knows if Moses is even coming back. And Aaron says, okay, he is longing for this too. They make the golden calf and they say, this is the God who took us out of Egypt. They just transfer all their feelings onto this object. Maybe this calf is like objects they saw and worshiped in Pharaoh's Egypt. It's probably familiar. And no, it's not at all like that terrifying thunder and lightning and Revelation business that was so new and scary, and then led to them being left alone. The golden calf, she says, was an attempt to create a technical solution to an adaptive problem. The Israelites could not emotionally, psychologically, spiritually handle all the loss and the change they had just undergone. They wanted a quick fix, a known answer to this problem, and there was a leadership void. So they rushed in to make today like yesterday, but it was false because it wasn't true to the situation. So just offering up another contemporary rabbi's drosh, right? Her attempts to take, here, there's actually a bunch of them from many different movements who have been captured by this whole technical adaptive leadership set of notions, and have looked for ways to synthesize those ideas with what they're finding in these texts about Moses, the liberation. So I now hand off to Rob, who's patiently had his hand up, and to anyone else to share what thoughts you might have. I'm curious where this leads.
Well, I'm not sure. I think Paul actually had his hand up first. Paul, did you want to? Okay, all right. I think I don't know. It seems like we're mixing up the issue of adaptive leadership versus the task at hand, which is to adapt. And the other point is, from Moses's perspective, I'm not sure that it's adaptive leadership, because guess what? He knew freedom. He wasn't like every other person that never knew freedom in their lives. So for him, it could be technical because he knew it and he's following God's plan. What is the adaptation that he's doing, or style that he's using? But he has a completely different mindset, which was part, I think, of the issue of why there needed to be a new generation, because the people that were there had no concept of freedom, and they therefore couldn't get out of that mindset of being a slave. Moses didn't have that, wasn't hampered by that because he was never a slave. Yes, he had other problems, but he was free. So anyway, that was my.
Yeah,
Thank you. Who's next?
exactly. I mean, the whole thing shifted from being about leadership to being about problems. Right? There's some problems for which there are easy answers. Did you fill out your timesheet? There's some problems for which there aren't easy answers. What do you do when the Pharaoh's doing this? Right? It's not about leadership. It's about how tough the problem is and who can meet the challenge of a tough problem.
And part of its recognition, part of the leadership is the recognition that the old solutions won't work. And so that the adaptive leader is the ones who recognize that this problem needs a shift, paradigm shift, as they say. I mean, I keep thinking about climate change. That's my lens for a lot of things nowadays. And that all the leaders of the earth, political and economic, need a paradigm shift. And that, you know, I'm overpowered sometimes by the difficulty of that. But so it's not either or, it's both, right? It's if the problem isn't new, isn't novel, then one can solve it without adaptive leadership. Okay. Or one can solve it without being particularly creative. You know, one just needs to harness what's already known. I mean, we're circling around that.
They also have to be willing to do something. It's one thing to recognize that a situation is complex and can't be solved with the current strategies. It's another thing to have the creativity to come up with an adaptive solution, and beyond that, to be someone who can rally others to participate in that solution.
Yeah, and that's where it's useful to be a charismatic leader, or to be inspirational. I mean, Roosevelt, thankfully, was somebody who didn't get assassinated before he did some of the very important things he did.
And a lot of this gets back to a different way of dividing things up. It's about framing, right? You know, when you're sending out the COVID vaccine, do you promote the COVID vaccine in terms of the help it may bring to your own health, or do you present the COVID vaccine in terms of the health that it might bring to the community? You know, are you protecting yourself, or are you protecting others?
Same with masks.
And that's just about recognizing the problem and framing the problem in a way that people will respond to it. You know, all the Kahneman Tversky stuff about framing things.
I'll just throw this in. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, your reference to climate change, you know, when we were talking about how I guess the previous thinker, and I've heard this before, you know, this whole idea of the generation that, you know, was not going to be able to embrace this idea of active freedom. And I keep thinking of this in relation to climate change.
And the sunshine movement and the next generation who seems to be willing, and the current leadership who doesn't. And we don't have time to wait for a generation to do it.
No, we don't. So what the hell are we going to do?
Well, and for what it's worth, a couple of people I know who work full time on trying to foment, you know, radical change to save us from this fate. This goes back to framing a little bit. They keep hoping there'll be a successful movement to rename this issue. They think that the name climate change is disastrous because it in and of itself just sounds benign. And it easily lets people who are against taking the steps needed say, look, the climate was always changing.
Right.
You're making claims about the fact that it's always changing, that, how can you prove that to me? They said they wish that was a crucial mistake. The term that should have been used by the movement trying to avoid this from the beginning was climate collapse.
That's a great point.
And, the truth is, even that's a metaphor, because the climate's not going to collapse for the various organisms that will benefit. The climate's going to collapse for us. It's climate collapse for humans.
And many other species too.
And a bunch of other species will go down with us. But that's what, right? I mean, we can't break the universe, and Earth will carry on for billions of years, whatever we do to it, unless we actually develop the technology to literally blow it into little pieces. But
I think
short of that, what we're really talking about is preventing climate collapse.
Yeah, I think that's important in all sorts of things. And in politics, there's a book called Words That Work by Frank Luntz, who's a political, unfortunately, he's a Republican. But for example, he reframed, changing the estate tax. I mean, most people in the world don't give a shit about the estate tax, but when they started calling it the death tax, suddenly all sorts of people who were never going to be in the position of having to pay it were against having an estate tax. He did the same thing with, look at abortion. One's cause is pro-life. Who could be against pro-life? And I've always said that when Democrats use words, they should not use words that only appeal to Democrats. So for example, if you hear somebody say they're deeply troubled, they're a Democrat. There's all sorts of things they say that are not the way regular people talk. And the political people who I interact with, I've tried to convince them to get somebody who's sort of an analog to Frank Luntz to get words that work. But
so people are working on it, just.
Well, look, I love the discussion around framing and words and labeling, and I just brought it up. So, and I want to bring Rabbi Rettenberg back for just a moment. So,
can I interrupt for 1 second? At the end of this, I'm gonna tell you all about a book that I read. I don't actually like it that much, but you all might be interested in it because it's about Passover and it's written by a guy who's a smart guy, but I find it slightly off-putting. But I'll do it till the end.
Okay, sure. You've piqued my curiosity. Okay, so Rabbi Rettenberg writes, sometimes in moments of destabilization in society, in times of trauma and fear, when there is no true adaptive leadership to help people face the loss that comes with change, then the people willing to take your gold and call it God show up and claim to have all the answers, no matter how many people they hurt along the way. So she names that danger, and I appreciate that she does, because, whether we all agree or disagree precisely about the usefulness of this whole terminology of technical versus adaptive leadership, I think that it sounds to me like there's fairly strong consensus among those who've spoken, at least, that, just because the times may call for adaptive leadership doesn't mean that the folks who show up waving that banner and offering the promise of adaptive leadership, are actually people who have good intentions or know what they're doing, or, are likely to help chart a path that makes the adaptation happen in a way that is good. So I think that that's an important piece here. And I'm glad that she brought it up. What other thoughts do folks want to share? And please don't be shy, Steve, about this book that you mentioned.
All right, I'll tell you the name of the book now. And it's called The Telling. And then it says, Judaism's Essential Book Reveals the Meaning of Life. And it's by a guy named Mark Gerson, who none of you will know who it is, but I know who it is because he had an investment related firm called Gerson Lerman. Now he's a relatively smart guy. I mean, I looked him up. He went to Williams and he graduated as a Summa. Then he went to Yale Law School, and then he moved to the investment business, but not actually as an investor. And he's made enough money that, he's made donations of $5 million to various causes. But what he's trying to say, he thinks the Passover Seder can tell you everything you need to know about life. And it's a long, important things about life. And the whole thing's just about the Seder. So it's, now, I don't know that, like I said, I found the book slightly off-putting, but I know, first of all, I don't like the guy because of his politics, but he's a smart guy who has interesting things to say. And if you're interested in both religion and philosophy and Jewish religion, you might want to read it. That's all.
Thank you.
I'm deeply appreciative of any time someone says, I don't agree with most of the author's beliefs. I don't even think I like the person. However, I'm reading their book and I'm still finding some things that are valuable in it. Like, to me, that is.
And by the way, when I was telling you about the words that work, the other thing you will know, if you ever hear somebody who's a politician says something is problematic, they're a Democrat. Normal people don't say problematic. Do you ever hear a Republican say problematic? No.
No, they don't. Of course you do.
What's the name of the author again? The book?
Frank, this book?
Yeah.
Mark, the book about the Seder.
Yeah.
Mark Gerson, Gerson.
Mark with a C?
Yeah, and he's married to a rabbi.
Okay.
His wife's a rabbi. Her name is Erica, but I can't remember her maiden name.
Okay.
I've going back to the golden calf, as we were reading this, as I was reading it, I'd want to look again at the words, but one thought I had is, or one question I had is were they worshiping the golden calf, or were they using the golden calf as an idol, as a symbol, as to worship Adonai, but in another form, because they couldn't get their heads around not being able to see, hear, touch a more concrete symbol. Because, same as way back in Abraham, the question in my mind is, were they really worshiping the idols, or were they just using the figurines as a symbol? Same way that Catholics pray to the saints, or to the images of the saints. Okay, I think that's an important distinction that we don't make enough.
I am glad you brought that up for what it's worth. I'm going to take the screen down now. You're bringing up a question that there's a lot of scholarship about, and also a lot in early rabbinic literature about, because on the one hand, most scholars of ancient Near Eastern civilizations believe that the statues and figurines that people had representative of the different gods, that people didn't the relationship with those icons was not one where, they thought that the object was the God. And, on the contrary, right, they basically were creating a shrine, a totem, a symbolic, sacred
Image,
object.
graven image.
Right.
The
They were
words right
creating
there.
a graven image as a focal point for their worship, meditation, spiritual relationship with.
And kvetching, and
Right.
asking, and asking
And
for favors, yeah.
exactly. And, in terms of, so, you could, there's a clearer argument to be made between the generations of ancient Israel that seemed to pivot to full-on monotheism, that they really were charting a different kind of theological path than many, many, many polytheistic societies that had dominated the ancient Middle East for a very long time. But the move to condemn the formation of any graven image to represent God, that was real, and that was a value that the ancient Israelites embraced. But it may have had different reasons. It may have had nothing to do with monotheism. And we're not really sure why they embraced the belief that there should be none of these images. And so your question is a live question, and the ancient rabbis debate about it. Your question about whether what was happening, Judy, was that the Hebrews following Aaron's lead think that they are now worshiping a different God than the one from before. It doesn't seem like that, because Aaron has them say to the calf, "This is the one who brought you out of Egypt." It seems like they have decided to have a graven image representing the God who has been their redeemer through this whole ordeal. And it's also interesting that the text doesn't say that they named this God. The mistake really may not have been the mistake of worshiping other gods. It may entirely have been the mistake of violating the commandment that Moses had given them, not to create any graven images. I see Debbie with her hand up.
I had a related question about Aaron and his instant recommendation that they go get the gold and make a graven image. Has anyone considered that he might not have been on the level, that this was something he was saying to try to get them to see the emptiness of their gesture?
There's not much. I'm not aware of any rabbinic midrash or early literature that tries to rescue Aaron in that way. I think what condemns him is the fact that he if he was bluffing, he caves. He follows through and actually goes through the steps of melting down the gold and fashioning the calf, and then
for sure. He made a pretty golden statue with all of their money.
Right, fair enough. On the other hand, the other thing that makes him not look so good is a few verses later when Moses comes down and smashes the tablets and loses his temper. There's a scene where he goes up to Aaron and basically says, "Explain yourself." And even though the earlier text in the Torah clearly says Aaron took the material, melted it down, made the statue, and then presented the statue, when Aaron tells what happened to Moses, he says, they set upon me, they brought me all this gold. I took the gold, I threw it into the furnace, and out popped this calf. So, not exactly a moment of Aaron like taking accountability. So, yeah,
The dog ate my homework.
Well, that is actually the Quranic version of Aaron. So I was struck by the difference between the Exodus version of Aaron and the Quranic version of Aaron. The Quranic version of Aaron is sort of what would have happened if Aaron had a bit of time to think and some time to hire a couple of attorneys and a PR firm. And it just runs with this image that he was railroaded into it. And he really didn't have a choice, and he didn't have anything he could have done. So, Aaron cuts a much more sympathetic figure. But the Aaron of Exodus is someone that I have to say that I relate to a great deal. And I couldn't help but think, and I was in a previous life philosophy professor, and every day in the classroom was a disaster of the golden calf, basically, because you had an unruly mob of students all traumatized and complaining and kvetching about something or another. And you somehow had to teach these kids Plato and Aristotle, which is a ridiculous proposition that was, conceived in the time of thunder and smoke back in graduate school. And now here you were actually trying to effectuate this, and it's ridiculous. And so you realized that you had to build a golden calf. I mean, there's no other way you were going to get through 75 minutes with these kids before anarchy let loose. And there was a sense of guilt and I don't know, whatever Aaron must have felt doing this, but also this sense of resignation that, you're saying some of the right things, granted, and, people later on will see certain affinities between what you're saying in this classroom and actual philosophy, but it isn't. But it's going to keep the peace. And I've always sympathized with Aaron, actually, because I've found myself in Aaron's predicament in just about every job I've ever been in.
What did you do? What did you teach?
I taught philosophy, but what ends up happening is there's a different pernicious kind of idolatry that takes place, which is that you become the center of the show. So, like I become a stand-up comedian instead of a philosophy professor. And that's the disaster of the golden calf in the classroom. And, I went on to clean ORs, and there's a different kind of disaster of the golden calf that takes place there when you're like in constant motion to pretend that you're doing something when you're in the OR is not nearly as clean as it's supposed to be, but management is here and you've got to put on a show.
Clean oars?
Sorry, what?
Clean oars? I didn't understand.
In an operating room, a hospital operating room. So I used to clean hospital operating rooms, and you promised to show for management and for the Joint Commission. And now I do hospital revenue management, and it's the same sort of thing. If people knew about the number of mistakes that are embedded in hospital data, they would overthrow the entire system tomorrow. But we keep them from doing that by putting on a good show. That was very cynical, but it's a very Aaron-esque take on all of this.
I so appreciate your sharing this, just this line of compassion and sympathy and relating to Aaron. And I would love to learn more. Maybe we can plan for a time. I would actually love to learn more about comparing and contrasting sacred texts, the traditions around Moses and Aaron. I've only scratched the surface of some of those studies myself, and they're incredibly rich and rewarding. And apropos of some of what I feel like part of what you were saying, Irfan, was partly about how, the banality of the golden calf phenomenon being part of everything in so many ways. So this is the photograph that Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg chose to embed in her post that I was reading from, instead of grabbing a screenshot of a golden calf, from somewhere else on the internet. And, clearly she lives in New York. So she couldn't resist, going there. Anyway, anyone want to offer a final thought? This has been a lot of fun.
I would love to learn more about the Quranic message and how that contrasts in the characters. I would really love that.
I think the key to the Quranic version of anything is that it takes the clever tack of saying as little as possible about anything. So in the case of any of the biblical figures, what it does is it pares down every story to the bare minimum, where there's very little incriminating because so little is said that you can't really pin anything on anybody. So it does a very good job of PR for a lot of biblical figures.
Good strategy.
Like a Frank Luntz level of PR, or
Better.
Even better. Anyone else? Well, please stand by for emails about our next gatherings and get-togethers. I'm so happy we got a chance to try this. This was a bit of an experiment. And it was a lot of fun for me, and I learned a lot, and I hope it was reasonably fun for everyone else.
Rabbi, I have another book that I haven't read, but I can recommend it in that I want to read it. It's by Aviva Zornberg, and she apparently she has a series of books about the different books of the Bible. So now I can't remember the name of it. The Particulars of Rapture, I think this one is called. Yeah.
Her books are dense and challenging, but extremely worthwhile, is what I can say. And okay, so happy Pesach for all. Ramadan Mubarak for those observing. Happy Easter for those who have family. And we'll meet again soon. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.